This is Mary Beth with Day One Life Coaching, and this is the first episode of Tell Me Your Story. And this is Joan Schmitz, and she wrote this book called Carried by a Feather. And the topic today is about grief. So, Joan, why don't you give a little background on how we met and why you're here, why you're my first guest?
Sure. Thanks, Mary Beth. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Mary Beth and I met, oh my gosh, it's been 20 years ago or
Has
so.
it been?
Yeah. When she moved in next door to me, here where we live in Ohio. And we just, as neighbors, we got to gradually know each other and then found out, despite our wide age range, I'm a little bit older.
It's not that wide.
She and I shared a lot of the same spiritual beliefs, and we have a lot of the same belief system. We've read a lot of the same books. And so we just kind of connected that way. And I've actually learned a lot from her, being, as I mentioned, being younger than me, I've actually learned a lot from her. And we've just kind of stayed in touch over the years and share this bond about our spirituality, I guess.
Absolutely. And we're not next door neighbors anymore. She's still in her house, but we're both still in Cincinnati, but different neighborhoods. Okay, so what we're going to do is, well, first of all, I wanted to make sure that I say this in the beginning. I am going to have, Joan is a wonderful author, and this book, I'm going to have the link, the Amazon link to it below. So make sure you look for that, Carried by a Feather. And make sure that you hit like and subscribe to this channel. We're going to do an episode every single week. And also share with your friends. This one's about grief. The topic is one that has been taboo, and we're trying to, make it to where, we can actually embrace it, because no one is escaping grief over things like death and huge loss and trauma. And Joan is going to tell you a little bit of her background and how she is definitely an expert. Unfortunately, she has an expert not through books, but through life experience. So I'll let you kind of tell a little bit about how, I guess your first major loss would have been Alan?
Yeah. So my dad died when I was like 36 or 37. So kind of got through that. And then shortly thereafter, my husband, Alan, my first husband, Alan, was diagnosed with a very rare cancer, one that has a horrible prognosis. And he actually did pass away. And he was diagnosed when our son, Mark, was 6 months old.
Yes.
And so then he passed when Mark was 3.5. And then I actually, we were living in Texas, another thing that we share in common. And at the time, I moved up here and was living here, in 21 months after Alan passed away, I was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. And so I call this period of time in my life, there was a 7-year span from when Alan got diagnosed, my 7 years of trauma, because Alan was diagnosed and passed away. I was diagnosed, I beat my cancer, but at the tail end of my treatment, my son, Mark, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes.
That's right. And how old was he?
He was 7.
And when I moved there, and we both, oddly enough, another synchronicity was we both lived in Houston, and then we were Ohio, Houston, back to Ohio. So interesting. But so when I moved here, how old was Mark?
When you moved in
next door to you.
Yeah, he was so we moved up here when he was 3.5, almost 4. And I think you moved in shortly thereafter.
Yeah, he was really young.
About 4.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that.
And so anyway, so I kind of, got my head around the 7 years of all this stuff that had happened. And then tragically, Mark was in the spring semester of his sophomore year at Miami University, and he passed away from a diabetic complication. And he had just turned 20.
Yeah. So basically, I wanted to go ahead and keep talking to him, but I wanted to make sure that I get to my questions open, because we were speaking before this, a lot of good questions that we came up with together. First of all, I think a good one to ask is, do you believe that people can get over grief? Do you believe that, or is it just something that transforms you for life? How would you describe your journey?
I think that answer's changed over even just since Mark passed away, which was just 4 years this past week. And I think the answer to that is I don't think we get over it. I think the words I like to use now are we live alongside it. So I like the description of a motorcycle with a sidecar. So picture a motorcycle and you're traveling down the road and someone's driving. That would be me, the driver. And then in my sidecar is not another passenger. It's actually grief. That's and the loss, maybe not so much the grief, but the loss that I carry with me. And it's riding along for me for the rest of my journey. And I kind of look at grief and a loss of that magnitude, like a child loss, as something that I'm not going to get over, but I'm going to incorporate it into my life, and it's going to ride along with
your
me.
new life. I don't want to say your new normal. That's overused lately, the new normal. So what advice would you give to someone who is frozen or stuck in their grief? Like, it's so overwhelming to that person. They can't seem to find a way out. What advice, or was there anything that you personally did to help? Because to me, nothing, as a parent, nothing is worse than the death of our child. We are not supposed to outlive our children, right? And as you know, I have a son who is about to turn 19 in a couple of weeks, so very close to Mark's age. And and I knew Mark as well. And I noticed too with Mark, just a little background. Did you feel like he was kind of such an old soul, like almost this was part of his journey? Like it just seemed like he was such an old soul compared to any other child I've ever met.
Sure. Yeah, I do think so. I do think that he, and that has helped me. So kind of starting to answer your question a little bit, that has helped me because I always did think of him as an old soul. I think he was actually wiser than I was. I think he knew more at 20 in some ways than I did at the time, when I was in my later 50s. And I think that he was only here for a short period of time because he had a certain amount of work to do. He had a certain amount that he was here to learn and teach and do. And then that ended, and that he finished that work, and then he crossed over, he passed on. But with that said, I can talk as a parent, I can talk in spiritual terms like that, and an acceptance of it that way in a spiritual sense. But I will say, I don't think there's anything that trumps child loss. I don't. Right. I think it's the top of the food chain of the grief thing when you're talking about death and grief. Absolutely. And that it's been a rough 4 years. It's been a rough 4 years. So, but things have gotten better.
So if someone, to circle back to my question that I interrupted myself on, so if that person who they stopped living because something tragic like this, their child died, they stopped having joy or the ability to feel joy. Is there any one thing, or maybe like any tips that you can give someone, whether it be going to support groups, or like, what's the one thing that helped you the most? Was it faith?
For me, I do think it was my spiritual beliefs, which I'd had for about 20 years. I kind of reawakened myself to some of my spiritual beliefs, I like to say. Yeah. And so in my 30s, I kind of had this awakening process, and my spiritual beliefs that I still believe in to this day kind of developed, and I'm still honing them. I'm still reading and studying and meeting people that influence me and that reinforce those beliefs. But I will say that I think grief is such a personal journey. It's so personal to everybody's different. Every loss is different. We can lose. So you can say, like, you lost your mom recently. So you lost your mom and you're in your 40s. My stepdaughter lost her mom and she was 14. Those experiences are different. Right. We both lost a mother, but the impact of that is going to be probably a little bit harder and greater on Kaylin being a 14-year-old girl than it was for you being, your mom was a grandmother, what I mean? And so I'm not diminishing your loss or anytime we lose someone we love, it's hard, but I think that everybody's journey is going to be different.
Absolutely. And I 100% agree with everything you're saying. My mom was 78 or just in 79 actually, but newly 79 when she died. And it was on Christmas Day. And did I feel sorry for myself? Absolutely. But I could still reframe it in such a way. Like I had, a long life. I mean, my whole life, I'm 47 now, almost 48. And I could, I got to enjoy a lot of time with my mom here on earth, so, reframing it that way. And a lot of people don't have a mom, or like for a 14-year-old, that's very young to, not to compare, we shouldn't compare tragedies and traumas, because it's the meaning that we attach to it. It really is, because I could have been devastated. I could have gone down that road, and it was devastating. I'd never watched anybody die before. That was, and then it's your mom on top of that. And it's Christmas Day on top of that, but look at my son. He was there. He's 18, witnessing the same thing. So, that's going to affect him forever. So on, every Christmas, it is what it is. But something else I wanted to ask you about is right here, the stages of grief. Do you feel like, you always hear about the stages of grief and that they're not linear. Would you agree with that?
Sure.
Or do you think that they're even legitimate stages?
From
your experience.
I do, and what I've read, so I've kind of read back. Last year I read a couple of books by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, even though I was introduced to her back in college when I took psychology. Of death and dying when I was like 19 or 20 years old or whatever I was. So I actually, she wrote those stages for the terminally ill. Yeah. So the stages of grief that we hear about, the 5 stages of grief that we hear about, she really wrote for the terminally ill that are facing their upcoming death.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So, but it has translated into, and it is appropriate in many ways. Maybe the only one that's maybe not as appropriate is bargaining, because you can't really bargain and say, okay, so bargaining for a terminally ill patient, we'd be like, okay, if I quit smoking or I quit doing this, God, will you save me or make, you know what I mean? And so I don't know that bargaining is maybe as appropriate when you're in a grief situation, grieving a loss, like you're bargaining, if I do this, will this person come back?
Or maybe if, like in my case with my mom's cancer, we could do bargaining there, but in your case, you could not, because you found out Mark had died. You weren't there for it. There was no preparation, which has to be even all the more traumatic. No mental time to prepare.
No, there isn't. But I think that I do agree with her, and I do see how those stages have transferred into the grief. So I think anger, denial, the bargaining, the depression is one, and then the acceptance. So I do think that a lot of her work and a lot of those stages do apply to grieving. And I think that for me, like the one that I can speak to the most about with both Alan and Mark is the anger. And I think that anger is like an easy go-to thing for me anyway about certain things. But I think that anger at, what it could have, should have, like, or what could I have done, or what ifs, what could I have done, or angry at myself, or angry at the situation, or angry with Mark. There was a couple things that maybe things could have been intercepted. I don't blame anything on anybody, but some things that he gave a little shout out to some people, and those things weren't looked into. And so, but you know what I mean? You're angry at the situation. I'm not angry at anybody, but I think that anger is common. And then denial, I think sometimes is common, denial about, what led up to it, or your part, or, whatever it is. I think that, so I do think, but I think that getting to that acceptance stage. And again, we talked about not getting over it. Acceptance and getting over aren't synonymous. Right. Acceptance just means, hey, it's right along on my sidecar. Right. I've accepted. I can't change it. I've accepted it. I've made whatever kind of peace I can make with it. And it's going to live alongside me. It's never going to go away, but I'm going to learn from it and try to grow from it, and then try to do something with what I've learned. Exactly. And you do a lot of work with the subject of death and dying, and you want to tell everybody kind of about some work you've been doing since then, which I think is wonderful. Sure. I actually have been a hospice volunteer on and off since I was in college, and I was a psychology major, and I got introduced to hospice way back then, and then, kind of got out of it. And I currently do volunteer with the local hospice here in Cincinnati, where I visit patients for companionship. So I either go to their long-term care facility, so if they're in long-term, or into the home. And sometimes if I go into the home, I relieve a caregiver so that they can get out and do things. And so I do that. And then I've also been involved with death cafes. So here in Cincinnati, there's a gentleman and his wife that do death cafes. And it's really, and the death cafe concept is really just bringing people together like you and I are doing today to talk about death. And I bet no one's not no one, but I bet
90% of this audience has never heard of a death cafe, as I hadn't before you told me about it, a while back, but still, like, it's just so taboo. People feel really awkward. And that brings me to another question that I wanted to ask you about, what do people say and do? Like, we all feel so weird. And when somebody has someone close to them, especially a child, die, like, I had to ask you, do you remember that? I was like, what should I say? What do you want people to do? And what did people do that was, bad?
I think, there's a quote out there, and I'm going to misquote it, but it's by, oh my gosh, Elizabeth, her first name's Elizabeth. Her husband was a politician, and I'm blanking out on her name. But anyway, they lost a child, and she had a quote, and the quote basically says, don't think that if you say my son's name, so like if I ran into you in the grocery store and you said, hey, I was thinking about you and Mark the other day, don't think when you mentioned my son's name that you've set me back, and like I'm going to go tumbling.
Like you weren't already thinking about him 24/7.
Right. I'm going to go back into some deep depression because you brought, what I respect about you and what I want is I'm grateful that you spoke my son's name. And so she has a quote about that.
And people tiptoe around that,
yes,
right? They're like, should I say this?
Right.
It is uncomfortable, but I think what you said to me back when I asked you back when you first told me what happened with Mark is, you had said something about, well, it's only like, you only have to be uncomfortable for, a few minutes.
Right.
Like, imagine how it is. Like, we want to talk about it. We want to discuss it. We want to, because it helps, right?
Sure.
It helps. So you're not suppressing it, because then suppressing it leads to all kinds of other things and being triggered. And I think we still are going to get triggered, like back to the 5 stages of grief. We're something can trigger us right back into, I don't know about denial, but definitely anger.
Sure.
What you say, like, we could think we're okay. We could think we're healed. And then something traumatic happens again. And we realize, wow, here I am right back in this stage.
Sure. And I think that, it's like the elephant in the room kind of thing. So I think if you run into somebody and you don't know what to do about asking about, their loss, whether it was their parent, their child, their spouse, I think for the most part, I would say, I can't speak for everybody because again, everybody's journeys are different, but I think that most people want you to ask, or they want you to say their name, or they want you to ask how they're doing. Even if it's been 4 years, it's been 4 years for me. I do not take any offense if somebody says to me, because again, I didn't get over it. I'm not over my son passing away or my husband even passing away. I'm not over it. It's still there. It's still part of my life. So I think to ask
permanently,
yes. And the other thing I say is for any parent out there, and there's a lot of parents that have more than one child. I only had one child, but I think that for any parent out there, you would, if this happened to you, and God forbid it should, and for most of you, it never will, because it's still, a minority of people lose their children or bury children. But the bottom line is, if it happened to you, I believe that you would want your child's name to be spoken. You would want your child to be remembered. You would want them to be acknowledged. You would want somebody to call you up and say, hey, guess what? I thought about Mark yesterday. I was doing something, and I just wanted to tell you about it. Or he came to me in a dream, or that you still, no matter how much time has gone by, that you would still want someone to speak their name.
Absolutely.
And to acknowledge that they were here and that they mattered.
And something that helped me a lot with my mom is anytime I would start to, feel sorry for myself, which I think it's okay to feel sorry for yourself. I'm not saying any feelings are bad or invalid, but I would ask myself, and tell me if you did this too, like ever, but is this what my mom would want? Would my mom want me to sit around being depressed, or would she want me and focus on her death, or would she would prefer that I focused on her life?
Sure.
And that actually had another question about that. Like, what advice do you think Mark would give you regarding his death? Like, how would he want you to live? What would he want for you regarding this journey?
I don't think, I believe my beliefs are such that my husband that passed, or my son that passed, or, my parents or anybody would not want, I don't think any soul wants people over here still in human form, sad and angry and bitter
and stopping stuck, their life.
Yeah. And stuck and, and just, living in some kind of misery. I don't think that any soul would want that for somebody that they were connected to on this side and even that side. But I'm saying, and so I think that,
it's more of a tribute
Yeah, it is. And
if we're honoring their life instead of focusing on their
yes.
death.
And I think as if you lose someone like Mark that was just 20, that he understands far more about what all just transpired than I do because of where he currently resides.
Right.
But I think that he would want me here doing, fulfilling my own journey and fulfilling my own purpose and waking up every day and finding a way to fulfill myself and to help others, because he was very community oriented, very generous with his time. He volunteered a lot.
Yeah.
He was a very sensitive, giving soul. And so I think that he would want me to carry that on, his own work through me and what I do. And we shared that in common, our bond with giving back to the community and volunteering and things like that.
You just answered my next question was, what do you want people to remember? How would you remember about your son? And I know you shared a lot of that with me, is like, especially like people come out of the woodworks, and tell you, oh, Mark was this, and all the stuff that they said about how helpful he was and things like that, that you didn't even realize how much of the stuff he was doing behind the scenes. Because you had no idea until people started after his death. Unfortunately, we should start, complimenting people while they're still here, right?
Oh, sure. I think so. I think so. And there was a really nice article written about him at Miami University. You can Google that. If you look up Mark's name, Mark Hyams, it comes up.
Mark Hyams, Hyams.
Mm-hmm. It comes up, and the article, we learned things about Mark in that article, that his friends up at Miami talked about how he'd invite them to their room to play, to game and things like that, and how generous he was, and he'd have food, so we learned things about him, like through that article in particular, that we didn't know. And then two boys, or young men, that he's was acquainted with, one in college and one that he'd known before that, also got tattoos after he passed away, which is such a neat, an end thing for the younger group to do. But so that's like a permanent. So to me, every time they both have it, one has it on his stomach and one has it on his chest, but every time they're bare chested or showering or getting out of the shower, dressing, they can see that and they're thinking about him. And so I'm not telling everybody to go out and get tattoos. Yeah, but it just, I think that's a neat way it brings a lot of comfort. I think that's awesome. Brings me comfort to know that people inked up their body, with about my son. Yeah. And then a way to remember him. So.
Yeah. And, I believe it's these psychic mediums and stuff, and you've talked to some and I've talked to some, and I know that when there's a lot of times when they're connecting with spirit, they always bring up things like that. They bring up the things like that tattoo, that you got in remembrance of. People still exist. And that's something I wish everyone understood, that their energy is still around us. We're just, unfortunately, it's still a huge loss. Obviously, they're not here physically for us anymore, but they still exist, and I think those things do mean a lot. So regarding, this is a kind of an interesting question, but do you ever feel guilty feeling happy? Because, my mom's death was so recent. I could tell you, like, I kind of felt bad on some days, like when I was like, should I be feeling good right now? Like something good happened. Like shouldn't I be feeling sad?
I remember, that's funny that you said it, because when my dad passed away, actually before my dad passed away, a close coworker of mine, her dad died suddenly, like a heart attack or stroke, and it was sudden. And I remember, and I had always worried about my dad. He wasn't the healthiest of people, was a smoker and, overweight, and I'd always kind of worried about him as a kid and into my young adult life. And I would look at her sometimes, and she, because she was a very funny person, she is a very funny person and loves to laugh and I would look at her and say, look, Laura's still smiling. Yeah. And so when my own father passed away, I remembered that, like, it is okay to smile.
Right. You're learning what's acceptable. A lot of this stuff is cultural too, right? Sure. Like, let's think of that, because I don't think death is so taboo in other countries. So much as United States. Sure. It's hugely, like, people just don't talk about it. People get uncomfortable. And I think, and I know you agree with this, that, because you're so involved in this stuff like hospice and death cafe and things like that, we need to talk about it. No one's escaping it. We just have to have more conversations. And so people aren't so uncomfortable, because it's inevitable. Yes. It's inevitable.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
So I would say, what else would you want to talk about? Like your spiritual thing, like did you have any sort of spiritual crisis at all going through this? Were you able to maintain your faith the entire journey, or was there days where you were like cursing life?
So I mentioned that I had, kind of found my spiritual awakening had happened in my mid-30s, and then that prepared me for Alan getting sick and then passing away, and then ultimately Mark. And so what I'd say is, for me, my spiritual beliefs have helped me through this. What I believe in about we're not humans having a spiritual experience, we're spirits having a human experience, and that we're here on this journey, and that when we cross over, it all will make sense. This whole lifetime, however long your lifetime is, some have short lives, some have relatively long lives, but that will all make sense. Everything that's transpired, the good, the bad, and the ugly, will all make sense because of this journey that we're living and that we're going through here. So for me, those beliefs, my beliefs about life and afterlife and all that kind of stuff, they helped me get through these things. I think I would have been more lost and confused if I hadn't had a spiritual epiphany, so to speak, in my mid-30s, which was just after my dad passed away, and then prior to Alan getting sick, and then all these other things. Even my illness, getting cancer, you grieve. There's a grief involved with being diagnosed with something life-threatening,
absolutely,
like that. And so I think that those beliefs, my awakening to them, couldn't have come at a better time, and have helped me get through all of this tragedy.
Right. And she just brought up a good point that, grief isn't only death, it's illness. Terminal illness is definitely, you go through grief. There's a grief of addiction, like when you have to give up an addiction, like I had to give up alcohol. It just wasn't working for me anymore. I've grieved that because alcohol was a good friend of mine for many years. Relationships. So divorce, even just breakups, you can grieve over the loss, because it's really just the loss of anything that that really mattered a lot to you, that you're really attached to. Mm-hmm. And of course, the loss of a child or a loved one is the ultimate grief, in my opinion. So I don't think it gets any worse than this. So what would you say, like, this is one that I'm just going to throw at you, and I just thought of it because of the last answer you gave. So without faith, is there any like advice that you would give to an atheist? Like, what would help that person who doesn't believe in a higher power, who doesn't believe that life goes on after this? What could something that they could apply to their daily life, as far as like anything to do with like, working with their mind, working with their mindset, their thoughts? Is there any advice you would give that person who doesn't have faith?
Well, I think that, my go-to always is therapy and support groups. So I think that, and those therapy and support groups are for a lot of things. And I believe wholly in them, hence my psychology background, hence your coaching, career that you have, that we believe in that. We believe in therapy. And so I think that, again, everybody's journey is different. And if working with a higher power or having some kind of faith isn't your thing, or isn't part of your life, there's so many other ways to navigate grief. And there's a lot of books out there. I mean, if you're a reader, there's tons of books and probably podcasts and things even now that you can watch that weren't around, even 20 or 30 years ago. But, reading books, joining support groups, if that's your thing. And so there's child loss support groups. I'm on one on Facebook. There's divorce groups, and, so any kind of grief, I think that you can join something like that. And then if you are feeling, like a depression that's almost becoming clinical feeling, or you just can't move on, or you feel stuck, or whatever word you want to use, just go into therapy, like a one-on-one counseling situation, which talking to people, and whether that's in a professional setting. And I know that there's costs involved, but then I also know that there's ways to get around some of that. So, because I know our healthcare system can be expensive and everybody doesn't have access to good insurance or whatever, but there's other ways to get that kind of help.
Are there and maybe I was wrong about this, are there support groups that like if your family member died in hospice,
Yes.
isn't there like
Yes.
free support?
Yes, there's free support groups. So like if you, and I don't think you even have to necessarily have gone through that hospice.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that hospices all have support groups for family members. So once the loved one passes away, they follow up with you. It's not like they just like, okay, we're done, we're moving
Right.
on. You can follow up with the social worker. There's support groups. You can go to, we're blessed here in Cincinnati to have Fernside, which is a grief
Fernside,
support group for children. So if children lose a spouse or a sibling, not a spouse, I'm sorry, a parent or a sibling, we have grief support, and it's completely free.
And I remember you and Mark going
Yes,
to that.
we did.
Yeah.
Yes, we did. And we were fortunate to have that. That's not in every city, but we're fortunate.
Release
Yes.
That
Yes.
stuck in my head
Yes.
big time.
Yes.
Actually, one of my addiction recovery cards has a balloon release of letting go.
Yes.
And that's where I got it from, was from you telling me about that experience. That was so many years ago, but it just stuck in my head.
Sure.
It's like such a great, it's so symbolic.
Sure.
I'm trying to say.
And one other thing too, some of those things require you going somewhere, and maybe you're more of a private person.
Yeah.
Also, I know that you agree, I'm wholly believe in journaling and writing.
Yes.
So you don't have to be a writer.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yes, you do not have to be a writer. You don't have to, be great at writing or spelling or anything. You just sitting down with a piece of paper or on a computer or whatever feels right for you, and getting out your feelings and just writing out how you feel. And the good, bad, and the ugly. I mean, if you're feeling anger, I've done this exercise in a therapeutic situation about writing letters.
Yeah.
So like writing a letter to the deceased loved one, or even an ex-spouse, because we're including that in this grief conversation, but just writing a letter to that person.
So it's not suppressed.
Yes.
So because if we deny our feelings, they're still there.
Yes.
They're not going anywhere.
No.
And so denying them is just lying to yourself, and they're going to come out eventually in ugly ways that you don't want them to come out to other people.
Sure.
Because like that saying, hurt people hurt people. And that is true. There's no
Yes.
way around that. So you have to acknowledge your feelings. It's, the positive vibes only thing. I just wanted to, this seems like a really great place to stick in, toxic positivity, because how can you be positive when you're going through something like grief? You can't. It is okay. And to insist that someone has positive vibes only is unrealistic, and only a sociopath could have positive vibes only.
Yeah.
When someone is like a child dies or a loved one dies. We need to go through those feelings. We're, like you said, we're spiritual beings having a human experience, and having those types of dark emotions are human. The thing is, we just don't want to stay stuck in those emotions.
Sure.
We want to deal with them and not deny them and bring them up. That's all part of the healing process. And don't beat yourself up for having dark days and dark thoughts, because everybody does.
Sure.
Even the positive vibes only people, they have the dark days. They're just not admitting to them. And that's a fact.
And something else you and I believe in too is that we also holding in negative emotions or holding or suppressing emotions also can make you physically ill, because we definitely believe in the body, body, mind, spirit.
Yes.
Yeah. So that we're all three things. And so when I like to say, and I actually wrote this in an essay about death many years ago, but actually when one is out of balance, so the body, the mind, the spirit is out of balance, it can throw off all the other. It can throw off the other two, and that we can then create physical symptoms that, so we can literally make ourselves sick. Literally we can make, and I don't mean it getting cancer or, but just, migraine headaches or.
But you do mean that.
Yes. Yeah. I do.
You do mean that, because
yes.
that's exactly what you felt.
Yes.
Personally.
Yes.
This isn't for everyone, but when Joan got leukemia, she had an interesting, when her husband was dying and she was a caretaker. Being a caretaker is tough. It's rough, especially, you had a newborn and you're pregnant for a lot of that, right? So
no, Mark was 6 months
already here
yeah.
when he was diagnosed.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
then I have that timeline wrong. But at the same time, you're taking care of a baby and a dying husband.
Mm-hmm.
It's natural as human nature to feel like kind of angry about being, and feel sorry for yourself, like we were saying, to have some dark feelings about that. And then getting diagnosed with leukemia, there's a Louise Hay. She is an author that's kind of another synchronicity. We both were into her stuff, the mind-body connection. You guys, I'm a holistic life coach. That's what holistic means. HOLISTIC, mind, body, spirit. It is all connected, just like Joan said. It's if one of them's out of balance, the other one is too. And we might be able to trick ourselves for a little bit, right? And just be like, oh, I'm fine. there's damage going on when you're not dealing with your feelings. You have to deal with them. You have to take care of your body, or else there's going to be things with your mind. It's all connected. So, and all of that affects us as a whole spiritually, and it's going to affect our lives in general, how we attract, what energy we're putting out into the world. So it's so important to actually get in balance with that. So I took you off track. What were you saying?
No, I was just saying, I was just interjecting that about that I do think that, getting out those feelings. So again, whether it's therapy, whether it's reading books and or journaling or all the above, or being out in nature, or meditation, and all these ways that you can tune in to what's going on inside of you in your head, down to your cells. It's down to the
even music,
level.
like like you were, pick that music card. Connecting with music can really lift you up. And it's also good to know too, that, that's the good thing about support groups. You're not the only one going through this. I think we can kind of feel sorry for ourselves. Like, it's only me. No one else has ever had to do this. Reach out to people who have had the exact same thing happen to you. Yeah, everyone's going to feel different and attach different meanings to it, but at least there's some sort of connection where you don't feel like you're all alone in the world.
Sure.
But like, to circle back to the leukemia thing, with Louise Hay wrote a book called Heal Your Body. That was the name of it, right? And she healed herself of cancer. And we do believe that, and if this doesn't resonate with you, throw it out. But we do believe, this is one of the things that we connected on, is that our mind does affect our body and our spirit. And basically, Joan, if you want to talk about, do you want to talk about that? You don't have to.
Well, I can. I let you, and you kind of hit on a little bit. So when Alan got diagnosed, I did go to a very angry place. And I think I stayed there for the bulk of the 3 years that he was in treatment and before he actually passed. And I think I did a lot of suppressing of emotions. And I was just, I felt robbed. We had this little baby. Why weren't we having this life? Instead, I'm living at a cancer center and taking him back and forth to chemo. And so I think I was going through all that. And then ultimately he passed. And I think I suppressed a lot of anger. So 21 months later, when I was diagnosed, I did a lot of work with my therapist. I had a counselor, and I did a lot of work with her right after I got out of the hospital. I was in the hospital for 30 days, but once I got home, I started doing some in-depth work with her and really kind of going back really to the day of the diagnosis and finding out that I really had just stayed angry for the better part of that 3 years. And some of that might've been misdirected towards him, but it wasn't really directed towards him. It was just an anger about being
situational anger.
Yes.
Yeah, no one would blame you.
Right.
I've literally never known anyone who's had such one loss after another. Seemingly, it feels like they were too close. Like right when you recover from one, you've got another thing going on. I've never personally known anyone who's had that happen, and that's why, again, her book is amazing. You guys, Carried by a Feather. She is a wonderful writer. I'm so glad that you used this experience to help other people. That's what this tell me your story thing is all about. That's what I was hoping, to people like you would be willing to talk and tell their story. So what would you say? Well, first of all, is there anything else you wanted to add to anything about your grief journey and tips because I heard you say meditation, getting out in nature, like that's huge, like connecting with whatever you want to believe in, source. Connecting with God in that way by getting out in nature. And you mentioned podcasts, YouTube, guys. YouTube has pulled me out of a lot of stuff. There's really anything that you want to find is out there. There's somebody else who's been through it. We have such great access to all of these sources at all times. So help yourself, take that step and really try to find and connect with others who can do it. We've got the internet to connect to anybody in the world, all these online groups. If we can't meet them in person, we can even do Zoom videos, next best thing, but what would you say, what brings you hope throughout all of this? Like what is the number one thing that can still make you feel like, okay, to be here?
I think it ties back into what we've been speaking about. And I feel that, and I've said this numerous times since Mark passed, that we didn't pass together. So I look at it like his journey was complete and, he was on his own journey. Yes, I was his mom here on earth. And there's certain things I could control as I raised him, but certain things are so much as out of my control. And so he passed and I didn't. So I like to think, if I was meant to go, if my life was meant to end, either, literally like I crossed over, or I'm just stuck in this anger, bitterness, depression, whatever that I wouldn't be fulfilling my journey.
Right.
And so the reason I'm still here, and I've outlived Alan now by about 10 or 11 years, and I'm that much older than him. But I feel like I still am here for a reason.
A purpose.
Yeah,
right.
I still have a purpose. So what gives me hope, and some days are easier than others, is that I'm still here and I still have work to do. So I believe, and my book touches about this a little bit, about we're here as teacher and student. So some relationships that we engage in, or people that we meet along the way, where they're teacher and we were meant to cross paths because we're meant to teach them something, or they're meant to teach us something, meaning that I'm the student.
Yeah.
And so I believe in that every person we interact with is a teacher-student relationship, or, one or the other. And that what gives me hope about going on without my son, and for however long I'm still here, is that I still have work to do.
Yes.
And I still have people I'm supposed to influence with my own experiences and my ability to write and share my story, or speak and share my story. Or I still have people that I'm going to be meeting, or I'm currently engaged with, that are teaching me something. And so that gives me hope, because as a soul, I know I'm in human form, and this is Joan, the human, but my spirit came here to learn and to grow.
Absolutely. That's what I believe as well. The purpose of life is to always evolve and grow. And if you're still here, you're here for a reason. And I think what you just said reminds me that serving others is really the only way to get out of our own heads, like to go out and help other people, instead of being in your own head, in your own sadness. Sure, we're still going to feel sad when we're out, doing volunteer work. But it's going to help relieve it. It's a much better thing to do than numb yourself through, there's so many ways to numb ourselves these days. Even if it's just Netflix, just sitting there and numbing out, not participating in life, getting out and serving others. To me, and just being thankful and grateful for the things that you do have, right? Mm-hmm. Thankfulness. Mm-hmm. And the time that we did, it's definitely extremely sad to lose a child or anyone, but focusing on, would we rather have it to where we didn't have the 19 years or 20 years, it's of course not, we still, that's one thing to appreciate, So I'm going to put the link to her book in the comments below. And anyone who would like to talk about their story, please go ahead and comment below, or send me a direct message. And then also, if you're interested in my addiction recovery with the law of attraction cards, I'll also put that link beneath this video. And let us know what you think. Let us know if you agree. Let us know if you disagree with some things we said about grief. We're open to that. So everyone have a great day, and tune in for the next one. Thanks.